So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about power. Volts, amps, watts, and horsepower. Watts and horsepower are essentially the same thing. They both represent power. It's just that a watt is bigger than a horsepower. Freaking airplane. What is this spot? That's awesome. So what we're saying is that power equals volts times amps. And that means that energy equals volts times amp hours. And energy is measured in watt hours, isn't it? So watt hours equals volts times amp hours. And let's talk about the Sherman OG for a sec. That's the max, by the way. But the OG I know has 3200 watt hours. And the max is 3600. But anyway, let's talk about the OG. 3200 watt hours, 100 volt wheel. That means it's got 32 amp hours worth of... Sorry, not worth of. That's not a good way to say it. It's got 32 amp hours. It's got 3200 watt hours worth of cells. That's what you can say. And that's 240 of them. It's got 240 cells. For those that don't know, these things are filled with batteries, like similar to like what you buy at the petrol station, the gas station. You know, you get the D cells. They're about that size, but they're lithium cobalt or lithium, different chemistries. But that's what they look like, right? Just like a battery, just a normal battery. And it's got 240 of them. This has got even more actually. But the OG, it's got 240 lithium batteries. And they're called 18650 cells. Actually, this has got bigger cells. This has got the 21700 cells. It's got fatter, longer cells. But anyway, what I'm saying is that depending on how you arrange those cells, how you configure them, will determine the final voltage of the battery. But no matter how you configure it, you're always going to have the same number of watt hours, okay? And what people were telling me in an old, not an old video, like just a few videos ago, when I was talking about the Master Pro, I said it's like a bit of a joke because it's just a big heavy wheel with way too much battery that no one really needs. So it's a gimmick. All it's going to do is weigh you down, basically. And I said that, yeah, because after that, I think 3 people responded saying that because the Master Pro is 136 volts, so it's got a higher voltage than most wheels, like this is only 100 volt, right? Because that one's 136 volts, they upped the watt hours so they could match the amp hours of a typical Sherman Max, let's say. And that's why they had to do that. They had to have a massive battery because they've got more volts. So what they're essentially saying, and it's also something that Humbol Skitso asked me in I think the last video. He asked me whether a higher voltage or a lower voltage is going to give you maximum range for your EUC given a certain size battery, right? And so what the commenters though, in response to my comments on the Master Pro being a bit of a joke, they said that, well, I don't want to repeat it, you know, they said that because it's got a higher voltage, they need more amp hours, they need more watt hours so they can match the amp hours of a typical, you know, a Max or whatever. What they're essentially saying in saying that is that lower voltages are optimal for higher ranges. And that's completely dead wrong. In fact, just look at the EV world right now. What are they doing? They're upping from 400 volts to 800 volts. That's going to become the new standard, 800 volts. So why do they want such a high voltage? And another important question you might want to ask yourself, which directly relates to this, is why are power lines, you know, power lines you see around the city, why do they use such high voltages? It's because it's more efficient. It's plain and simple. Like I said earlier, power equals volts times amps. So if you want to deliver a given amount of power through a line, through a wire, which is what our EUCs are doing all through our system, is delivering power through wires. But let's talk about power lines, right? City power lines. If you want to deliver X amount of power through the wires, then you've got a choice, don't you? You can use a high voltage or you can use a low voltage or anything in between. If you use a low voltage, that means you need a really high current. You need lots of amps to match the power, to get the power that you're trying to get. What does that mean? It means you're going to heat up those wires. If you drive high amps through a wire, it heats up. That's like common electrical knowledge. And it means you need thicker wires then. But no matter what you do, you're gonna be getting decent amount of losses, especially when you're driving when you're setting power like 100 kilometers, let's say. You know how long power lines can be. So they really need high voltages, right? They don't want any losses. They want the most efficient system possible. So what do? They up it to like 100,000 volts, 1,000,000 volts. They use as much as they can possibly use. The more volts, the better, because it means you can use less amps and still have the power. Do you see what that means? You still got the power to do the same job, the same force, but you're using way less amps. If you're upping, let's say, to 1,000,000 volts, 10 million, whatever, the more the better, because you've got the power with less amps, less electricity flow. Like, I don't know if you know what an amp is, but it's a measure of current flow. You can think of it like water flowing through a pipe. The electricity is the water, the wires are the pipes. And the more current, the more electricity is flowing, the more electrons. They're little particles called electrons, and they speed through the metal lattice, essentially crashing into things on their way. The more you've got of them, the more collisions, the more friction. You've got all these things just crashing and crashing, producing heat, and you're losing energy, right? What happens when you lose energy? You lose range. It's no different for our EUCs. Of course, we've got way less wires compared to an overhead power line, but it's the same concept. If you can up the voltage, you can use thinner wires for one thing, which is a good thing. But the other thing is that you produce less heat. So what happens when you produce heat? You're wasting energy. Do you know how much energy is used just to produce even a little bit of heat? Heaters are the most inefficient appliances in your entire house, basically. You don't want to produce heat. That's wasted energy. And the more voltage you've got, the cooler your wires will run, and the thinner they can be. So it's, in theory, you're going to get more range with a higher voltage wheel. So it's completely wrong what they're saying, because what they're saying is that because the Bugatti Master Pro has higher voltage, they need a bigger battery. They need to pack in more cells because it's going to have less range, because it's less efficient because it's got a higher voltage. It's completely wrong. It's the other way around. Higher voltage gives you more efficiency. But that's in theory. In practice, they're right. Most people will burn through that battery very fast. And here's the reason, guys. Power equals volts times amps. So if you got more volts, you got the ability to deliver more power. So if you use that power, you can burn through the battery faster. And most people are going to do that. Most experienced EUC riders are very power-hungry riders. Power-hungry type of people, do you know what I mean? And you won't even notice it. You would just burn through that battery because you can, basically. And what I'm saying, though, guys, is that if you did a long-range test at 12 kilometers an hour, even up to 20, let's say 20 kilometers an hour, then the higher voltage is going to be a benefit. The higher voltage, let's say you had two Shermans, and one of them was just the OG Sherman, 100 volt, 32 amp hour wheel, so it's got 3200 watt hours. And let's say you had another Sherman, but they made it a 200 volt Sherman, so it's going to have half as many amp hours. It's going to have 16 amp hours, right? But it's still got 3200 watt hours. They've got the same amount of watt hours. And that gives you the idea of what these people are saying, right? Because the 200 volt Sherman is going to have half as many amp hours. It's going to have half the range, is what they're saying, basically. So they're going to need double the battery to match the range of the other Sherman, the 100-volt Sherman. Completely dead wrong. In fact, if you did the low speed test, like I said, at 12 kilometers an hour, the 200-volt Sherman is going to give you more range than the 100-volt Sherman, even though it's got half as many amp hours. Why? Because it's more efficient. Higher volts is more efficient. It's a more efficient system if it runs at a higher voltage. Like I said, it can have thinner wires. It's going to produce less heat as the electricity flows through the conductors. And that's about it, really. That's the main concept. The principle behind it is that power equals volts times amps. Therefore, amps equals power divided by volts, see? So if you can increase the volts, you're going to reduce the amps. If you can reduce the amps, you reduce the losses because there's less friction. Because less electricity flowing, less collisions of electrons with all the molecules, in the metal. And that's basically it, guys. Yeah, I don't know what else I can say about it. The main thing though is that most people, actually nobody in the planet really, to be honest, is ever going to go 12 kilometers an hour or 20 kilometers an hour for the entire ride. Like a super long range test. No one's going to ever do that. So in practice, the higher voltage will never give you more range because no one's got the patience to do that, really. It's not practical at all to ride at that speed. Because imagine how long you'd be riding for. Let's say so you got 4,800 watt hours and you're going to ride at 12 kilometers an hour. You're going to get about 240 kilometers of range. That means you're going to be riding for 20 hours straight, non-stop. Not a single break, 20 hours. Not even slowing down or speeding up. You've got to go the same speed of 12 kilometers an hour for 20 hours. Who can even do that? That's like some kind of feat. You've probably gone to the Guinness Book of Records. So in practice, they're right. No one will ever do it. No one's going to do it. What is going to happen is they're going to utilize that extra power that the high voltage can provide, and they're going to burn through the batteries faster. So they are right in practice. But here's the thing, you can be somewhere in the middle ground. You can just go for a more casual ride, like a fairly casual, not super slow, like 12 kilometers an hour, but just take it easier, and you're probably going to get a similar range. And yeah, that's it, guys. We'll leave it at that.